I've always been fascinated with how we learn, especially when it comes to picking up things that we're not naturally good at. Because for me growing up, that was most things. I would try stuff that seemed like it just wasn't in my wheelhouse, that it wasn't built for me. And so of course I was bad, but it didn't stop me from trying. And it really drove me to ask the questions of, can I get better? How good can I get? How do I train that process? And so I've had this obsession with learning and the actual process of doing so. And there's a book that I came across called Make It Stick: The Science of Successful Learning. This is published by Harvard's printing press. And there's a ton of gold in here before you even get to the first chapter. And there are very simple shifts that I discovered in this book that you can apply to your process to learn anything you want faster. Because the problem that I find is that when it comes to learning, most of our methods are outdated. Just like working out, we resort to the things that are familiar. So I have 10 plus years of coaching experience working with executives, athletes, and high performers. And so I'm very used to, this scenario where somebody doesn't know what they want to do, but they just know that they want to get fitter. And so maybe running is the thing that they think in their mind is what you do when you want to get fit. That's what you're imagining as a fit person. And so all of a sudden you begin running. And of course, it's not bad to run, but there are probably more efficient ways to get to your goal, or there are other ways that you can do that. It isn't just limited to running. And so similarly, when it comes to learning, repetition is the go-to, right? We know that, we need to repeat reading the same thing over and over. We need to study our flashcards and really kind of get things memorized. And so these patterns are things that we resort to because the last time a lot of us actually deeply learned was in some sort of a school scenario. But what I love about this book is that it makes lifelong learning a little more accessible, right? Because the truth is, in the modern world, we're going to be learning for the rest of our lives. And if we aren't willing to learn new things, that is where the decay begins, similar to, atrophy in our muscles. And so being able to train your brain the same way you do your body by making a couple of these tweaks in how you consume and absorb information, I think can go a long way. So let's start with one of the ideas, which is we confuse familiarity with understanding. And this is one of the problems it highlights about repetition and using that as a tool, is because it creates this fake sense of mastery. So you think that by memorizing these terms, you are actually gaining a sense of mastery over this subject when you're not. You're just memorizing these definitions. And so it's really important to think deeply about what are the aspects of your game that you want to work on in the first place. And most of these are going to be things that aren't fun, right? Because you're not good at them. So instead of just training things that you're good at over and over, start by focusing on the weak points in your game, the parts that, really make your brain wrestle with the problem. So let's dive into some of the main highlights that I had in this book. So one of the first ones is what we mean in this book when we talk about learning. We mean acquiring knowledge and skills and having them readily available from memory so you can make sense of future problems and opportunities. There are some immutable aspects of learning that we can probably all agree on. First is to be useful. Learning requires memory. So what we've learned is still there later when we need it. And second, we need to keep learning and remembering all our lives. And then third, learning is an acquired skill, and the most effective strategies are often counterintuitive. So this sets the tone for what learning is. It comes up with a agreed upon definition. And then it goes into this section where there's about these claims that we make in this book, right? And this is where I had a ton of highlights that just, really made me think. Now, this next highlight that I had is learning is deeper and more durable when it's effortful. Learning that's easy is like writing in sand, here today and gone tomorrow. And so this is an example of what we've covered in the past, where learning is effective when there is struggle involved, similar to training a muscle, right? If you are lifting the same weight and it's gotten easy for you over time and you're not challenging the load, the volume, the intensity in any way, then the gains are going to slow down because you do need that challenge, that effort to be there. And so you want to put yourself in scenarios for learning where that is demanded. Now, this next learning concept that's essential is retrieval practice. So this is the idea of recalling facts or concepts or events from memory is a more effective learning strategy than review by rereading. Retrieval strengthens the memory and interrupts forgetting. And so an example of this is if you are using flashcards, you are trying to actually dig deep and figure out in a low stakes scenario what the answer is. And that effort of trying to recall what you're searching for has a more lasting impact on learning than you simply rereading something, which is the common way to kind of, try to memorize or learn things. And then a little lower on that page, there's a sentence, while the brain is not a muscle that gets stronger with exercise, the neural pathways that make up a body of learning do get stronger. When the memory is retrieved and the learning is practiced, periodic practice arrests forgetting, strengthens retrieval roots, and is essential for hanging on to the knowledge you want to gain. Now, this next concept is pretty game-changing and kind of builds on what we just discussed, which is where it talks about spacing out practice at a task. So when you get a little rusty between sessions or you interleave the practice of 2 or more subjects, retrieval is harder and feels less productive. But the effort produces longer-lasting learning and enables more versatile application of it in later settings. And then the next part is trying to solve a problem before being taught the solution leads to better learning, even when errors are made in the attempt. And so this is where that idea of looking at a flashcard and trying to recall, what's on the other side, what are you trying to search for? That effort alone, even when you're wrong, is much better than when you're just given the answer. And so a modern day example of this practice is instead of just asking ChatGPT right away and deferring the decision to it, it's taking a shot at solving the problem yourself, taking a guess at what the answer might be before you give ChatGPT the prompt and, get your answer. So that's a mini example of how you could implement this learning tip in the process of using AI, which we're all going to be doing to some extent. Now, this next learning concept is pretty affirming of something that we've heard for decades, right? It's called elaboration. There's no known limit to how much you can learn. Elaboration is the process of giving new material meaning by expressing it in your own words and connecting it with what you already know. The more you can explain about the way your new learning relates to your prior knowledge, the stronger your grasp of the new learning will be, and the more connections you create that will help you remember it later. And so a great example of this is when you are reading a book. You come across something that strikes you, right? Your brain pays attention to it. All of a sudden, what you can automatically do is begin to connect that piece of information, that knowledge, to other problems, other scenarios in your life, other things that you already know, and try to describe it in that context, even if it is just mentally. That effort alone can go a long way in helping you make something stick. Now, this next sentence affirms what I just said as well, which is putting new knowledge into a larger context helps learning. And so if you're able, while you're reading, to take that piece of information, and again, your life, your problems are a bigger, larger context, that is a way that you can help to ingrain some of that knowledge. Now, this next section is really important because it discusses mental models. So people who learn to extract the key ideas from new material and organize them into a mental model and connect that model to prior knowledge show an advantage in learning complex mastery. A mental model is a mental representation of some external reality. A core part of this working is dependent upon you looking out for the right cues. So similar to a baseball player who is waiting for a pitch, there are all sorts of cues that you're looking out for so that in an instant, you can connect that to what you know and make a decision about how you should swing the bat, how you should approach and try to make contact. And so similarly, there are cues that you're constantly looking for. And a great way to experiment with mental models, I think, if this is your first time kind of thinking about them, is to look into Charlie Munger. Charlie Munger is a master of somebody who has collected useful and simple mental models that really stand the test of time and work in a variety of situations. And you can begin to kind of experiment with using that as a way to think, and of course then to also develop your own that are more specific to the stuff that you are learning. Now, this next highlight is important because it's discussing about how our ability to learn is not hardwired into us from birth. Because when you actually, it says every time you learn something new, you change the brain. The residue of your experiences is stored. It's true that we start life with the gift of our genes, but it's also true that we become capable through the learning and development of mental models that enable us to reason, solve, and create. In other words, the elements that shape your intellectual abilities lie to a surprising extent within your own control. Understanding that this is so enables you to see failure as a badge of effort and a source of useful information. And then a couple paragraphs down goes into how making mistakes and correcting them builds the bridges to advanced learning. And so this is coming back to that concept of struggle and things being effortful. So when you are trying, when you are making mistakes, what this is doing is it is giving your brain new cues to look out for. Wow, I didn't expect the ball to go this way. How did my body change? How did my reaction time and my speed change when that happened, right? It allows you to collect this new information so that the next time you're presented with that cue, you're able to hopefully respond in the way that you want, and you're able to do it much quicker. Now, this affirms something that we hear all the time. You learn more from your mistakes than your successes, right? But in practice, in reality, we are not wired to want to fail. So how do you grapple with that problem when you realize that it is so essential for learning? And I found that the solution to this is creating a system where you are able to fail in a low stakes environment. This is what training is, right? When you are training for a sport, you are training all those weaknesses outside of the game itself, outside of the match itself, right? And so oddly, this flashcard method that was discussed earlier is something that I've been doing for a couple months now. And of course, it's been a throwback to, days in school where you were using Quizlet and that kind of stuff. But it is funny to see years later that that was effective. And why? Because you have a low stakes environment where you can look at something and your brain can be challenged to figure out what's on the other side. What am I trying to recall here? And so Ryan Holiday's note card system is the thing that I'm using. I've of course adapted it and molded it a bit to kind of my own needs, like he encourages everybody to do. But one of the things that is ingrained with this practice is when I come across something that I'm inspired by, that strikes me, whether it's a quote, whether it's a sentence in a book, these things, these highlights, each of them have actually made their way onto a note card. And that process of me transferring them onto a note card not only allows me to store it and in a physical way be able to resurface it, unlike maybe, something that gets lost in my notes app until I find it again. It's something that I will stumble upon, and I'm naturally going to try to recall and make connections between a lot of these note cards just because it's there. It's almost like this open loop that your brain wants to close the second that you see one of your note cards. You're like, oh, this thing is about cognitive psychology, what I write here, right? And then that process of reviewing the material in a way that, you're not failing. There's no A's and B's being given out, but you are able to sweat a little, right? Similar to when you were training your body, breaking a sweat, challenging the muscle. You're trying to get yourself to a zone where you can experience that. And I found that Ryan Holiday's note card system definitely gives you some space to try that, but it's not the only one. There's so many other ways to do it. Highly recommend that you give it a shot though. Just be sure that the stuff you're putting on your note cards isn't giving you that fake sense of mastery, right? And you're not just putting down definitions and terms and stuff that can easily be looked up later and that doesn't really have a big effect on maybe your understanding overall. Yes, it might maybe if you're taking a test or something, but for understanding a subject to solve a problem like AI, that's not something where you're just going to write terms for the sake of it because, you could just look that up. But how you might be using that tool, certain prompts you want to remember, certain practices, that I don't want to forget. So for example, one of the researchers that works at Anthropic said that when you are prompting any LLM, before you actually go ahead and make it do the thing you want it to do, asking it to confirm if it understands all of your instructions and repeating it back to you before actually beginning the task. That is something where you can catch the mistakes of, what it was going to do, and it can kind of clarify those things before it begins, and you can probably get a better response. So that was a trick when I first heard it. I was like, oh, that's great. I want to use that later. I want to remember that and resurface it later. Do you see how capturing this into a note card is a different way of thinking than if I was just memorizing these concepts for a test. That piece of information may not have even stuck out to me if I was memorizing this stuff for a test, right? You might be more focused on other definitions and things that help you win the game of the test. But when there is no real test aside from the actual projects and problems that you're solving, you want to be sure to actually be consuming information and capturing that information that, is useful to the learning that you want. It isn't just stuff that's easy for your brain that is giving you a fake sense of mastery. So remember, if there's one takeaway from all this, is that repetition is not as effective as you think. Retrieval is where it's at. And struggling to retrieve and making mistakes is totally okay. It is still having a deep impact on your learning. And so we will be coming back to this book. I'll be doing more episodes on this in the future just because there's so much in it. Make sure to check it out in the description if you want to get a copy. And if you found this episode useful, make sure to like, comment, subscribe wherever you're at. That goes a long way. And of course, sign up for the Habit Chess newsletter in the description below. I appreciate you hanging out, and I hope this approach helps you with learning what you want faster.